What's the moment a daughter realizes her silence was slowly becoming its own kind of lie? I told my dad his wife was cheating on him on a Tuesday evening in his garage, while she was at her gym class that never seemed to involve any actual Pilates. But that's not where the story starts. My name's Nadia. I'm 29. My dad's Robert. And for most of the 3 years he's been married to Claire, if you'd asked how I felt about her, I'd have given you an answer that was true as far as it went, but incomplete in a way I didn't fully understand until about 6 weeks ago. I never disliked her. I want to say that clearly up front. This isn't a story about a stepdaughter who spent 3 years looking for a reason to blow up her father's second marriage. It's a story about a series of small, deniable things I noticed and filed away without examining too closely. For exactly the same reasons my own dad had been doing it for 3 years without ever letting himself add them up out loud. My parents' marriage ended quietly, without drama. The kind of divorce people describe afterward as amicable, because nobody said anything unforgivable, which I came to understand isn't quite the same as it being painless. They'd simply drifted over a decade into two people who ran a household efficiently together, and had almost nothing left to say once the logistics were handled for the day. My mom told me once that the hardest part wasn't the arguments, because there weren't any. It was the specific loneliness of sitting across a dinner table from someone for 15 years and slowly realizing neither of you had noticed when you'd stopped being interesting to each other. My dad met Claire about 8 months after the divorce was finalized, through a work colleague's dinner party. I want to be honest about what I watched happen to him in the months after that, because I think it's the most important piece of context for everything that came later. He fell for her in the specific headlong way that only happens to people who've spent the last stretch of their life quietly convinced nobody would ever choose them again. He was 54. Claire was 41, funny at dinner parties, endlessly attentive to him in front of other people in a way that made him visibly light up every single time. My dad had spent the tail end of his marriage to my mom feeling like background furniture in his own house. And Claire made him feel from the very first dinner like the most interesting man in any room she walked into. I don't think there's anything shameful in that. Most people, given the chance to feel chosen again after 15 years of quietly not being noticed, would fall exactly as hard and exactly as fast as my dad did. Now let me walk through what I actually noticed over those 3 years, in the order I noticed it, because the pattern only became visible in hindsight, the same way it did for my dad. The first thing was the phone. Sometime in the second year of the marriage, Claire developed a habit of angling her phone face down the moment anyone approached the table. Smooth, consistent, barely registering as a habit at all. I noticed it specifically at my dad's birthday dinner, watching her flip it over in one fluid motion the instant I pulled out the chair beside her. I told myself plenty of people are private about their phones. I filed it away. The second thing was the gym. Claire joined a boutique fitness studio about 18 months in. 4 sessions a week, always in the evening. What struck me slowly wasn't the frequency. It was that her body never seemed to change in any of the ways 4 sessions a week of anything usually produces. I'm not proud of how long it took me to let that observation sit next to the phone flipping instead of filing them separately as unconnected curiosities. Some part of me actively avoided putting those two things in the same mental folder, because I understood even then what that folder would eventually have to mean. The third thing happened at a dinner party my dad hosted for old university friends. Claire excused herself twice in 40 minutes for work calls she couldn't avoid, taking her phone to the hallway both times. His oldest friend Jeff made a small joke about it afterward, something about her being in high demand, and I watched my dad laugh along a beat too quickly. The specific way people laugh when they're trying to close a subject rather than finding it funny. And I understood, without being able to name it exactly, that some part of him had already noticed the same thing I had, and had already decided not to look at it directly either. The fourth thing started about 3 months before the barbecue. Claire began taking long drives on weekend afternoons to clear her head, 2 or 3 hours at a stretch. Always alone, always described afterward in the same handful of vague, pleasant words. Peaceful, exactly what I needed. Good thinking time. My dad mentioned it to me once, almost admiringly. Said he was glad she had something to decompress. I nodded along, and I separately did a small piece of quiet mental arithmetic I didn't let myself finish. That a woman who drove 3 hours on a Saturday afternoon to clear her head had never once suggested my dad come along, and had never once come back with anything specific to say about where she'd actually been. I sat on all 4 of those observations for well over a year before the barbecue finally broke the pattern, and I want to say plainly, I didn't go looking for anything that day. It was a Saturday afternoon in my dad's garden, a family barbecue for no particular occasion. Claire's phone and mine happened to be in the same case, a coincidence that had come up as a joke between us more than once before. I picked hers up off the garden table by accident, reaching for what I assumed was my own. A message notification lit up the lock screen before I'd even fully registered whose phone I was holding. The Baizhao name saved in her contacts was Pilates Mark. The preview line underneath had nothing to do with Pilates. I put the phone down almost immediately. I didn't go looking for more. One line was already more than enough to understand the shape of what I was looking at. I sat with that knowledge for close to a month before I said anything. And I want to walk through what that month actually looked like, because it's the part people skip past when they hear the short version. I watched Claire laugh at my dad's jokes at 4 separate Sunday dinners over those weeks. I watched him refill her wine glass without being asked. The small automatic gesture of a man who still, 3 years in, hadn't run out of ways to show her she mattered to him. I watched him spend 2 afternoons on his laptop planning an anniversary trip to Portugal, reading out descriptions of hotels along the Algarve, watching her face for which ones lit her up most, while she nodded and pointed at photos and said things like, "That one looks perfect." Already knowing something he had no idea he didn't know, I felt something curdle a little further inside me each week I said nothing. Curdle is exactly the right word. It wasn't a single decision to stay silent. It was a slow, accumulating spoilage of my own conscience. Each week added more weight to the specific discomfort of watching someone I loved plan a trip with someone who already knew, in some sense, that the trip might not mean what he thought it meant. About 2 weeks after the barbecue, my dad called me on a Wednesday evening just to chat. Somewhere in the middle of an entirely ordinary conversation, he went quiet for a second and said almost to himself, "Do you ever get the feeling someone's only half in a room with you, even when they're right there?" I asked what he meant. He laughed it off immediately, said he was just tired, probably overthinking things, work stress, and changed the subject to the football scores. I let him change it. I've replayed that exact exchange more times than almost any other moment in this whole story, because I understood, even in the moment, that he was reaching toward the exact same knowledge I was already sitting on, from the opposite direction, and neither of us said the actual words out loud to the other, both of us in our own ways, still hoping we were wrong. I told him in his garage on a Tuesday evening while Claire was at her gym class. My dad's garage has always been his place. A workbench along one wall, an old radio tuned to a classical station. I found him fixing a shelf bracket that didn't strictly need fixing, the kind of small, purposeless project he takes on when he needs something to do with his hands, while his mind is elsewhere. I told him plainly, without dramatics. I said I'd picked up Claire's phone by accident at the barbecue and seen a message from someone saved as Pilates Mark, and that the content of it wasn't anything a married woman sends her fitness instructor. I said I wouldn't have told him if I hadn't been certain enough to risk him hating me for it. My dad went very quiet. Want to describe that quiet carefully, because it was the most important single moment in this whole story. It wasn't shock exactly. It was the specific quiet of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't want to finish, adding together a column of small things he'd noticed himself over the previous 2 years and had never let himself add up out loud, because doing the sum meant arriving at an answer he wasn't ready to live inside yet. He asked if I was certain. I told him I wasn't guessing, that I'd read the actual words with my own eyes. He said quietly that he needed a little time to think before Claire got home, and I left him alone with that. Claire came home about 20 minutes later, glowing from her workout, hair still slightly damp, and found both of us sitting in near silence at the kitchen table. My dad asked her quietly who Mark was. She laughed first. That bright social laugh I'd watched her use at 100 family gatherings. Then she saw our faces and the laugh stopped mid-breath in a way I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of. Then she turned on me instead of answering him. She said I'd always hated her. She said I'd been waiting for any excuse to destroy something good for my dad. She said I'd made the whole thing up out of jealousy, because she'd built a happier home in 3 years than my own mother had managed to build in 15. She stood up hard enough that her chair knocked back against the counter behind her. And she said I'd always resented her for making my dad happy, and this was my chance finally to take him away from her. My dad sat through all of it, watching her, not saying a single word. And I understood watching his face that he already believed me completely, and that he was simply waiting, with a kind of patient, terrible calm I'd never seen on him before, to see exactly how far she was willing to go before she finally stopped attacking me and answered his question. She never once denied the message. Not in the entire 15 minutes she spent attacking my character, instead of answering a single direct thing my dad had asked her. He let her run the full length of it. And then, once she'd finally run out of things to say about me, he asked her again, plainly, without any theatrics in his voice at all, whether she'd slept with him. She went quiet for the first time since she'd walked through the door, and that quiet, more than anything she'd shouted in the previous 15 minutes, was its own kind of answer. She left that night to stay with her sister, still in her gym clothes, without packing a bag, without looking back at either of us on her way out the front door. The aftermath was quieter and, in its own way, harder than the confrontation itself. Claire told people within her social circle a version of events in which I'd invaded her privacy, read through her private messages, and presented a single ambiguous text out of context to destroy a happy marriage out of long-standing jealousy. Her sister Fiona called my dad a week later. Not on Claire's behalf, she was careful to say, but to pass this along. My dad told her calmly that the actual sequence of events was considerably simpler. A phone had lit up on a table, unread and unopened beyond that first line, and the only person who'd needed to explain 15 minutes of behavior instead of answering a single direct question had been Claire herself. Fiona didn't push back. She told my dad before she got off the phone that she'd suspected for close to a year that something wasn't right, based on things she'd noticed herself at family occasions, but had told herself it wasn't her place, as a sister, to go digging into her siblings' marriage on the strength of a suspicion alone. I recognized that sentence the moment my dad repeated it to me. It was almost word for word the same reasoning I'd been giving myself for over a year, which is the part of this story that stayed with me longest. How many people, across how many separate relationships to Claire, were independently doing the same private arithmetic, and independently deciding, each on their own, that it wasn't quite their place to say the sum out loud. Preeti, who ran Claire's fitness studio, told my dad, without any prompting beyond a single direct question, that Claire and the instructor's private sessions had quietly increased in frequency over the previous 18 months in a way that, in her professional experience, usually meant one of exactly two things. And almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that Mark's own wife had called the studio about 6 weeks earlier, around the same time as the barbecue, as it happened, asking carefully whether Preeti had ever fielded concerns from other members about Mark's conduct with female clients. 5 separate people, at minimum independently doing the same math over roughly the same 18 months. Not one of us comparing notes with any of the others until a phone lit up on a garden table by accident and forced the whole thing into a single room at once. My dad hasn't filed for divorce yet, as of the last time we spoke about it directly, but he's told me plainly he has no intention of Claire moving back into that house, and that he's already spoken to a solicitor. His solicitor, Howard, asked him during their first meeting whether he wanted the divorce papers to reference the affair specifically, or cite the more neutral standard grounds most divorces use. My dad told me he'd sat with that question for a long moment, because some part of him, even now, still wanted to protect some version of Claire from the full, formal, documented consequence of what she'd done. The same instinct that had kept him from adding up the phone flipping and the gym membership and the long drives for well over a year before I forced the sum into the open. In the end, he told Howard he wanted the papers to state plainly what had happened. He said he'd spent enough of his life managing other people's comfort at the expense of his own clarity, and he wasn't willing to keep doing that in a legal document that would exist on paper for the rest of both their lives. My mom, when I finally told her the whole story, was quieter about it than I expected. She sat with it on the phone for a long moment, then asked me gently how he was actually doing. Not how the situation looked from the outside, how he was doing underneath it. She said something a few days later that I've turned over a lot since. She said watching what happened with Claire had given her a kind of retroactive peace about her own divorce that she hadn't expected to feel. At least what we had was honest even at the end, she said. It just quietly stopped being enough for either of us. That's a very different thing from what he's dealing with now. She said she hoped, whenever he was ready, he'd let himself believe that being chosen wrong once doesn't mean he's unchoosable. It just means Claire, specifically, was never as trustworthy as the version of her she let him fall in love with. My dad told me something a few weeks later, sitting in the same garage. Both of us quiet for a while before he said it, unprompted, like he'd been working up to the sentence for days. He said watching Claire spend 15 minutes attacking my character instead of answering one simple question had told him everything he needed to know about which one of us had actually been protecting him that whole time and which one had been managing him. I didn't have anything to say back to that beyond thank you, because I understood hearing it that it was the closest thing to a real apology he was ever going to be able to give me for the version of events Claire had tried to build in that kitchen. What I think about the most now is the month I spent sitting on what I'd seen on her phone. I understand now that it wasn't really about being certain enough of the facts. I'd been certain the moment I read that first line. It was about being ready to risk the version of myself that had spent 3 years being the reasonable stepdaughter who didn't make waves, in exchange for a version of myself my dad might, for a while at least, resent for finally making one. I don't know yet how long it will take him to stop doing arithmetic in a quiet garage on his own, working out what it means to have loved someone that completely and been wrong about her in a way he never let himself see coming. I've decided I don't need to know the answer to that yet. I just know I'll be the one who tells him the truth again. Plainly, without dramatics, the next time it matters, whatever it costs either of us to hear it.